At our anniversary dinner, my husband raised a toast and laughed. 5 years wasted on a gold-digging nobody. The guests chuckled until I slid a folder across the table. Funny, I said. Because this fake prenup means you get nothing. And those texts with your sister's best friend? They just went to everyone you know. The lawyers arrived with divorce papers before dessert. But the real surprise, I wasn't meant to understand the difference between a tax write-off and tax evasion. At least that's what Jameson believed when he casually discussed falsifying business expenses across our kitchen table while I prepared his coffee. With my back turned, he never noticed how I positioned my phone, recording every word as I nodded sympathetically. "You wouldn't get it, Marissa," he'd say, the condescension in his voice growing more pronounced with each passing year. "Your literature degree is great for reading bedtime stories, but this is real business." And I'd smile, playing my part perfectly. For 5 years I maintained a meticulously crafted persona. The supportive, simple wife who traded her academic ambitions for domestic bliss. My bookshelves of classic literature served as the perfect prop for his narrative about me. A woman who lived in fictional worlds and couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of his financial empire. What Jameson failed to recognize was that my love of literature had taught me to observe, to analyze patterns in behavior, and to recognize the subtle foreshadowing of a man's true character. In the early days of our marriage, the dismissiveness was subtle, a patronizing smile when I asked about his work, the way he simplified explanations as though speaking to a child. I noticed, but I also noticed something more valuable. When he thought I wasn't intellectually equipped to understand, he stopped hiding things. By our second anniversary, he'd begun leaving financial documents in plain sight. By our third, he was taking business calls in front of me, discussing questionable practices with his partners while I quietly folded laundry nearby. "Don't worry about her," he'd say. "Marissa's too busy thinking about her book club to understand what we're doing." What began as hurt pride slowly transformed into calculated observation. I created a simple system. A separate email account where I forwarded photos of documents, transcripts of conversations, and notes about patterns I observed in his business dealings. Initially, it was just a way to prove to myself that I wasn't as simple as he believed. I had no plan for the information. I just couldn't bear the thought of being as ignorant as he assumed. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday 14 months ago. Jameson had left his laptop open while he took a shower, and a notification appeared from someone named Vanessa. The preview showed just enough. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again when she's visiting her parents." My hands trembled as I clicked the message. There she was, Vanessa Miller, his sister's best friend since college, the woman who hugged me at every family gathering while apparently sleeping with my husband. I scrolled through months of messages, each more intimate and disrespectful than the last. "She doesn't suspect a thing," Jameson had written, too busy with her books to notice the real world around her. I took screenshots of everything, added them to my growing collection of evidence, and returned the computer exactly as I'd found it. When Jameson emerged from the shower, I greeted him with the same warm smile I'd perfected over years, but something fundamental had changed. My documentation was no longer just about wounded pride. It had become ammunition. 2 days later, I reconnected with Andrea Blackwell, a college acquaintance who had become a lawyer specializing in divorce and financial crimes. Our coffee meetup appeared casual to anyone watching, two old friends catching up. But beneath the surface, I was carefully testing the waters, asking hypothetical questions about marriages, prenuptial agreements, and financial disclosure laws. "It's for a character in a novel I'm outlining," I explained when Andrea raised an eyebrow at my specific questions about recording conversations and financial evidence gathering. She didn't believe me, I could tell, but she answered each question with professional precision. Our occasional coffee dates evolved into strategic planning sessions disguised as friendly gatherings. Andrea never pushed me to admit what we were really discussing, and I maintained the pretense of creative research for months. It wasn't until I showed her a particularly damning transcript of Jameson discussing hiding assets that she finally closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Marissa, if your character has this kind of evidence, she needs to be very careful about how and when she uses it," she said, her voice low and serious. "Some of what you've described goes beyond grounds for divorce. We're talking potential criminal charges." That conversation shifted everything. Andrea helped me organize my evidence. explaining what would matter in divorce proceedings and what might interest federal authorities. She connected me with a forensic accountant who, under the guise of helping with research for my book, analyzed the patterns in Jameson's financial documents. The most shocking discovery came when the accountant found discrepancies in our prenuptial agreement. The document I'd signed had been subtly altered after my signature was added, with clauses inserted that effectively left me with nothing in the event of a divorce. The manipulation was clever, not obvious enough to be immediately detectable, but clear once someone knew to look for it. This isn't just unethical, Andrea had explained. It's illegal and invalidates the entire agreement. For the next several months, I perfected my performance as the oblivious wife, while secretly preparing for the moment when I would shatter the illusion completely. I purchased small, undetectable recording devices. I backed up every piece of evidence in multiple locations. I learned the specific legal terms for each of Jameson's financial transgressions, and I waited for the perfect moment, our 5th anniversary dinner, the elaborate celebration Jameson had insisted on hosting at Harlow's, an upscale restaurant downtown. He'd invited 40 guests, mostly his business associates and friends, with a sprinkling of my family members to maintain appearances. The invitations had gone out weeks ago, embossed with gold lettering that read, 5 years of partnership and success. As I traced the raised letters with my fingertip, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. 5 years of partnership and success indeed, just not the kind Jameson was celebrating. Last night, I laid out my outfit for the dinner. A sophisticated navy dress that Jameson had once called suitable for a faculty wife. I placed Andrea's business card in my clutch alongside a small thumb drive containing 5 years of evidence. In the morning, I would contact the IRS's whistleblower office with a carefully prepared report. The ticking clock on our bedroom wall counted down the hours until our anniversary dinner. Tomorrow Jameson would stand before our friends and family, glass raised in a toast to our marriage, and I would finally stop playing the role of the simple, tolerant wife he had forced me to become. The morning of our anniversary dawned with an unusual serenity. My hands should have trembled as I applied my makeup, but they remained steady. 5 years of practice had perfected my composure. Jameson had already left for the office, promising to meet me directly at Harlow's. "I've arranged everything," he'd said, kissing my forehead like one might pat a child. "Just show up looking pretty." Harlow's gleamed under soft lighting when I arrived precisely 30 minutes early. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Coleman, your husband has arranged a beautiful evening. The Magnolia Room is ready." I followed him through the main dining area to the private room Jameson had reserved. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a horseshoe-shaped table adorned with white roses and silver accents. Place cards with calligraphy names marked each setting, with Jameson and me positioned at the center curve. I made a slow circuit of the table, memorizing the seating arrangement. His business partners clustered to his right, my family relegated to the far ends. My manila folder slid perfectly into the side table drawer near my seat. I checked my phone one last time, confirming that Andrea would arrive precisely at 9 p.m. The text messages were queued and ready to send with a single command. 5 years of calculated tolerance would end tonight. Guests began arriving at 7 p.m. Jameson's parents entered first, his mother embracing me with the practiced affection of someone who had always viewed me as a sensible, if uninspired, choice for her son. "You look lovely, dear," she said, her eyes already scanning the room for more important people. Jameson's father merely nodded, his attention fixed on the bar setup. My sister Claire arrived with her husband, immediately sensing my tension. "Are you okay?" she whispered as she hugged me. I squeezed her hand reassuringly, the only person in the room who might have detected the steel beneath my smile. Jameson made his entrance at 7:30, surrounded by his 3 closest business associates, all laughing at some shared joke. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His eyes found mine, and he offered the same indulgent smile he'd given me for years, affectionate but dismissive. "There's my beautiful wife," he announced, crossing the room to kiss my cheek. "Always punctual, always perfect." His hand lingered possessively at my waist as he whispered, "I've arranged for the Thompson account to be finalized tonight. Jeffrey's here and will sign after dinner." I nodded appreciatively, knowing that the Thompson account was one of his more creative tax evasion vehicles, another piece of evidence already documented and reported. Dinner progressed with practiced elegance. Conversations flowed around me while I maintained my role, smiling at appropriate moments, asking the right questions about children and vacations. Jameson grew increasingly animated with each glass of wine, his hand occasionally patting my thigh beneath the table while he largely ignored me above it. Between the main course and dessert, Jameson's business partner Daniel clinked his glass. "I think it's time for a toast to the happy couple." Jameson stood, champagne flute in hand, the room quieting as everyone turned toward him. His smile carried that familiar edge, the one that appeared when he felt particularly clever. "5 years ago, I made what my friends called the safest bet of my career," he began, generating appreciative chuckles. "Marriage to the quiet literature professor who was more interested in fictional worlds than the real one around her." I maintained my smile as murmurs of discomfort rippled through some guests. My colleagues warned me that marrying someone so academically focused might be challenging for a man in my position. He gestured expansively, but I saw what they didn't. A woman who would never question my business decisions, who would be content with the lifestyle I provided while staying safely in her lane. The room had grown awkwardly silent. Even his closest friends looked uncomfortable. "So here's to 5 years wasted on a gold-digging nobody," he concluded with a laugh that failed to disguise the cruelty beneath the words. "Who knew that my simple wife would be my greatest asset?" The polite chuckles that followed held more discomfort than humor. My sister's face had flushed with anger, and even Jameson's mother looked embarrassed by his display. As he sat down, looking pleased with himself, I quietly opened the side table drawer and withdrew my folder. The moment had arrived. "I'd like to respond to that lovely toast," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. Jameson's smirk remained fixed as I stood, folder in hand. "It's true that I've been quiet these 5 years," I continued, sliding the folder across the table toward him. "But not for the reasons you think." Jameson's expression shifted slightly as he glanced at the folder without opening it. "What's this, honey? Anniversary gift? Perhaps save it for later." "Oh, but it can't wait," I replied. "It's funny you should mention assets because this fake prenup, the one you altered after I signed it, means you actually get nothing." His face drained of color as he flipped open the folder, revealing side-by-side comparisons of the original prenuptial agreement and his fraudulent version, with forensic documentation of the alterations. "And speaking of assets," I continued, removing my phone from my clutch, "those texts with your sister's best friend Vanessa? They just went to everyone in this room." As if choreographed, phones began chiming throughout the room. Guests reached for them reflexively, confusion turning to shock as they viewed the explicit messages and photos I'd discovered. "What have you done?" Jameson hissed, half rising from his seat. "Exactly what you never expected me to do," I answered calmly. I paid attention. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. Jameson's mother was staring at her phone in horror, while his father looked away in disgust. My sister had moved to stand behind me, her hand resting supportively on my shoulder. "You've misunderstood," Jameson began, looking desperately around the table. "These messages are dated and time-stamped," I interrupted, "with your location data attached. Interesting how often you were working late at Vanessa's apartment." His business partner Daniel had already moved several seats away, studying the prenup documentation with growing concern. "Jameson, is this true? Did you falsify legal documents?" Before Jameson could answer, the restaurant's front door opened, and Andrea appeared in the entrance to our private room, legal briefcase in hand and 2 colleagues trailing behind her. "Ah, perfect timing," I said. "The lawyers are here with the divorce papers. I believe we're just in time for dessert." Andrea's heels clicked confidently across the hardwood floor as she approached our table. The restaurant had fallen eerily silent, with only the soft classical music continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Jameson's face contorted between fury and disbelief as he recognized her from the charity gala we'd attended 6 months ago. You're the tax attorney from the Children's Hospital benefit," he stammered, the realization dawning slowly. Andrea smiled politely. "Among other specialties." As she placed the leather portfolio containing the divorce papers on the table, my mind flashed back to a crisp autumn evening 3 years ago. Jameson had been on the phone with his accountant in our home office while I dusted the bookshelves, seemingly absorbed in my task. Listen, just move the Henderson payments through the Cayman account first, he'd instructed, feet propped on his desk. The IRS doesn't have the manpower to track every international transfer. Besides, technically it's not illegal if we route it through the consulting subsidiary first. That night, I transcribed his entire conversation verbatim, my literature degree finally proving useful in ways Jameson never anticipated. Years of analyzing text had trained my memory to capture dialogue with remarkable precision. I developed a system for recording what I could, then expanding the transcripts with detailed context and observations, noting his tone, his body language, the specific words he chose. I've prepared everything according to your instructions, Andrea said now, sliding the documents toward me rather than Jameson. All the evidence we discussed has been properly filed with the appropriate authorities. Jameson lunged for the papers, but his business partner Jeffrey intercepted his arm. Don't make this worse, Jeffrey muttered, his own face ashen as he glanced between his phone and the prenup evidence. Another memory surfaced, Jameson at our kitchen island 18 months ago, laughing into his phone. Of course, she doesn't understand the Thompson restructuring. He thinks it's just some corporate reshuffling. The woman reads Jane Austen for fun. She's not exactly equipped to spot a shell company. What Jameson never realized was that my literary analysis skills made me exceptionally good at spotting patterns and inconsistencies. When numbers repeatedly appeared in his documents that seemed at odds with what he claimed publicly, I didn't need an accounting degree to flag the discrepancy. I just needed patience and attention to detail, qualities Jameson had always dismissed as the fussy habits of a bookish woman. This is ridiculous, Jameson sputtered, looking around the table for support. Whatever she thinks she's found is completely taken out of context. Is that so? Andrea replied smoothly, removing another document from her briefcase. Perhaps you could explain the context of this recorded conversation from February 12th, when you instructed your CFO to cook the books for the quarterly filing, or this email chain where you discuss creating fake invoices for services never rendered. The blood drained from Jameson's face. You recorded me, he gasped. That's illegal. One-party consent is perfectly legal in this state, I said softly. Something you might have known if you'd ever bothered to listen when I mentioned the research for my novel about white-collar crime. My novel had been the perfect cover. For 2 years, I'd openly discussed fictional scenarios with Jameson that mirrored his actual activities, gauging his reactions and gathering information on his understanding of legal boundaries. He'd unwittingly educated me on exactly which laws he was breaking, all while believing I was crafting an imaginary story. You were writing about me? Jameson's voice cracked with indignation. Not initially, I admitted. But you became such a compelling case study in financial fraud that I couldn't resist. The dessert cart appeared in the doorway, the server faltering when he sensed the tension in the room. Andrea waved him in. Please continue, she said smoothly. We're just concluding some business. Jameson's attorney Mitchell Davis burst through the restaurant doors, breathing heavily as if he'd run from his car. Don't sign anything, he commanded, approaching our table. Too late for that advice, Andrea responded. But your client might benefit from your counsel regarding the IRS investigation. What IRS investigation? Mitchell demanded, looking bewildered. I met Jameson's eyes directly. The one triggered by the whistleblower report I filed 3 months ago. All those evening phone calls when I said I was talking to my sister, I was building a case with the Financial Crimes Division. Jameson's complexion turned gray. You wouldn't understand enough to document your systematic tax evasion. I interrupted. To identify the shell companies you created to hide assets, to track the falsified charitable donations. Actually, I understood everything, Jameson. I just never let you see that I did. The chocolate souffle arrived at our table, the server placing it between us with practiced elegance, oblivious to the destruction of a marriage happening around him. Jeffrey stood abruptly. I need to distance myself from this situation immediately, he announced, gathering his coat. Several other business associates followed suit, mumbling excuses and avoiding Jameson's desperate gaze. You can't just leave, Jameson hissed. We've worked together for years. You're involved in half of these deals. That's exactly why I'm leaving, Jeffrey replied coldly. And why you'll be hearing from my attorney tomorrow. As Jameson watched his carefully constructed network disintegrate before his eyes, a strange calm settled over me. The souffle deflated slightly in the center, much like Jameson's illusion of control. You know what's ironic? I said, breaking the silence. If you had ever bothered to actually read any of the novels on my bookshelf, you might have recognized the classic narrative arc of hubris and downfall. Literature has been warning men like you for centuries. Jameson's mother approached our table, her face rigid with controlled emotion. I'd like to understand exactly what's happening, she said, addressing me directly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. Your son created fraudulent financial records, evaded taxes, and manipulated legal documents, I explained gently. And he's been having an affair with Vanessa for at least the past year. She nodded once, removed her pearl necklace, Jameson's anniversary gift to her, and placed it on the table. I believe this belongs to your company, not to my son. Without another word, she collected her husband and departed. As the room continued to empty, Jameson turned to me, his voice low and dangerous. You spent 5 years planning this, living a lie? No, Jameson, I corrected him. I spent 5 years married to a lie. Tonight, I'm finally telling the truth. Mitchell pulled Jameson aside, their urgent whispers carrying just enough for me to catch fragments about damage control and preliminary injunction. The remaining guests hovered uncertainly between tables. Their anniversary celebration had transformed into something unrecognizable. My sister Claire approached, sliding into the chair beside me. I always knew he was a jerk, she said quietly. But this is beyond anything I imagined. For the first time that evening, genuine emotion cracked through my carefully maintained composure. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass. I've been living with this knowledge for so long that I almost forgot how shocking it really is, I admitted. Claire squeezed my hand. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't risk anyone knowing, I replied. Jameson had to believe I was exactly who he thought I was. Too simple to understand, too devoted to question. Across the room, Jameson's college friend Thomas was deleting contacts from his phone, his expression grim. I'm out, Jameson, he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. The Davidson contract was bad enough, but this, he gestured toward the evidence folder, this could implicate all of us. You're overreacting, Jameson snapped, desperation edging into his voice. Marissa doesn't understand what she found. It's all perfectly explainable. To whom? Thomas countered. The IRS. They see I have a family man. I'm not going down for this. As Jameson watched another pillar of his carefully constructed world crumble, something shifted in his expression. The shock and disbelief hardened into something darker. He straightened his tie and approached our table with renewed purpose. We need to talk, he said, his voice low and controlled. Privately. I don't think that's necessary, Andrea interjected smoothly. Anything you have to say can be directed through legal channels from this point forward. This doesn't concern you. Jameson, think about what you're doing. 5 years together means nothing to you? You're willing to destroy everything over some misunderstanding. For a moment, the familiar pattern nearly reasserted itself. His commanding tone, my anticipated acquiescence. The muscle memory of submission twitched within me. Then I remembered his toast. 5 years wasted on a gold-digging nobody. There's no misunderstanding, I replied, my voice steady. And there's nothing to discuss. Jameson leaned closer, lowering his voice. You think this little performance makes you powerful? I built everything we have. When this is over, you'll have nothing and no one. Something unexpected happened then. I laughed. Not the polite, accommodating laugh I'd perfected as Jameson's wife, but a genuine sound of liberation. I already had nothing, Jameson. You made sure of that. The difference is now I know my own worth. My straightened posture and direct gaze seemed to unnerve him more than any words could have. He'd never seen this version of me, the woman who wasn't performing deference. You'll regret this, he threatened. I only regret not doing it sooner. As Jameson retreated to confer again with his increasingly agitated attorney, my former friend Emma approached hesitantly. She had distanced herself from me over the years, gravitating toward Jameson's more successful circle. Marissa, I had no idea, she began, her expression conflicted. The way he talked about you at dinner parties, I just assumed that I was exactly what he described. I finished for her. That was the point, Emma. I should have seen through it. I should have checked on you. Her remorse seemed genuine, but I wasn't ready to absolve her so easily. Yes, you should have, I agreed quietly. 5 years is a long time to believe the worst about someone you once called a friend. Emma flinched at my honesty. In the past, I would have rushed to ease her discomfort, to smooth over the awkwardness. But that woman, the one who prioritized everyone's feelings above her own, had served her purpose. I didn't need her anymore. Across the room, Jameson's remaining business associates huddled around their phones, frantically checking accounts and messages. The elegant anniversary dinner had devolved into a crisis management session, with former allies now potential liabilities to each other. My brother-in-law Mark, who had always been quiet around Jameson, surprised me by bringing a fresh glass of wine to our table. Thought you might need this, he said, setting it before me. For what it's worth, I always knew you were the smartest person in any room Jameson entered. Yet you never said anything. I observed without rancor. I convinced myself it wasn't my place. Mark nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. I was wrong. As conversations continued around us in hushed, urgent tones, Jameson's phone rang. The ringtone, a specific chime he used only for his executive assistant, cut through the murmurs. He checked the screen, his face draining of color as he answered. What do you mean they're there now? His voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by barely controlled panic. Don't let them access anything. Nothing. I'm on my way. He ended the call, looking around the room with fresh desperation. I need to go to the office. There's an emergency. What kind of emergency? His lawyer asked sharply. Federal agents are at the building with some kind of warrant, Jameson admitted, his voice barely audible. The revelation rippled through the remaining guests. 2 more business associates immediately made for the exit, avoiding eye contact with Jameson as they fled what was quickly becoming a sinking ship. For the first time since I'd known him, Jameson looked truly lost. His carefully curated image, the successful businessman, community leader, devoted husband, was dissolving in real time, revealing the hollow center beneath. Did you do this? He demanded, turning to me with naked fury. What exactly did you tell them? I remained seated, the calm at the center of the storm. Everything you told me, Jameson. Every conversation you had in front of your simple wife. Every document you left where I could find it. Every meeting you took in our home. The second agent approached with handcuffs. Jameson instinctively backed away. This is a mistake, he insisted, his voice rising. These are complex business matters. My wife couldn't possibly understand enough to. The lead agent interrupted. The evidence Mrs. Coleman provided was remarkably detailed and precise. In 20 years with the Financial Crimes Division, I've rarely seen documentation this thorough from seasoned professionals, let alone a civilian. A third agent appeared with a laptop. Mrs. Coleman, if we could verify some final details before we proceed? There are a few transactions we'd like to confirm with you. Jameson watched in stunned silence as I discussed complex financial maneuvers with the agent, using terminology and referencing transactions that Jameson had always assumed were beyond my comprehension. The Davidson Shell Company was established in March, I explained. But the fraudulent invoices didn't begin until after the Thompson restructuring in June. Jameson kept the original paperwork in his home office safe, combination 27-14-36, behind the reproduction Mona Lisa. Jameson's attorney had gone pale. Stop talking, Jameson. Not another word. But Jameson wasn't listening. His eyes remained fixed on me as the realization fully dawned. All this time, he said hoarsely. All those evenings when you were reading in the corner. All those dinner parties when you just smiled and nodded. I was paying attention, I said simply. Something you never bothered to do with me. The agents proceeded with the arrest, leading a shell-shocked Jameson toward the door. As they passed our table, he paused, handcuffed wrists awkwardly positioned in front of him. Why? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. What's the point of all this? Why go through with the anniversary dinner? Why the public humiliation? You could have just had them arrest me at the office. I considered his question carefully. Because you needed to understand what you'd done. Not just the financial crimes but how you diminished me for years. Tonight wasn't just about legal justice, Jameson. It was about finally being seen. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps the first glimmer of genuine understanding he'd ever had about me. Then the agents continued guiding him toward the exit. As Jameson disappeared through the restaurant doors, the remaining guests began to disperse, murmuring in shocked tones about what they'd witnessed. Andrea collected her documents and approached my table. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. I took a deep breath, assessing the hollow space where fear and anger had lived for so long. "I think I will be," I replied, surprising myself with the truth of it. Claire wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "What happens now? Do you need a place to stay tonight?" I shook my head. "The house is in my name as of this afternoon." Another detail Jameson never bothered to read in the documents I occasionally asked him to sign. Andrea smiled appreciatively at this final strategic move. "The federal case will take months, possibly years. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing for 5 years," I reminded her. "I can handle a few more months." As we gathered our things to leave, I paused at the table where Jameson and I had sat side by side for the last time. The anniversary cake remained uncut, the decorative 5 toppers now seeming like a different kind of countdown, one that had reached its conclusion. The classroom hummed with energy as my students debated the symbolic significance of wealth in The Great Gatsby. I watched them from behind my desk, appreciating their enthusiasm for literature in a way Jameson never could. Dr. Wilson called out Amber from the back row, using my maiden name, which I'd reclaimed. "Do you think Daisy really loved Gatsby? Or just what he represented?" "What an excellent question," I replied. "What does the text tell us about the difference between genuine connection and the performance of love?" The discussion bloomed, students referencing specific passages while I guided them toward deeper analysis skills I'd once used to dismantle my husband's criminal enterprise. Now those skills were channeled into nurturing young minds at Riverside Community College. After class, I gathered my materials and headed to the campus coffee shop, where I'd established an informal weekly gathering for female students interested in financial literacy. What had begun as casual conversations had evolved into structured sessions covering everything from compound interest to recognizing financial red flags in relationships. My phone buzzed with a text from my publisher confirming our meeting to discuss the manuscript of my book Hidden in Plain Sight, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense. The advance had been modest, but the early interest from women's groups had surprised everyone, except me. Outside the coffee shop I spotted a familiar face. Vanessa, Jameson's former mistress, hovering uncertainly near the entrance. Our eyes met, and I braced myself for confrontation. Instead, she approached with visible hesitation. "I saw the flyer about your financial literacy group," she said, avoiding direct eye contact. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. The old Marissa might have turned her away or offered immediate forgiveness to avoid discomfort. Instead, I considered her request thoughtfully. "The group is open to any woman who wants to learn," I replied finally. "Everyone deserves financial independence." Vanessa nodded gratefully and followed me inside, where a dozen women of various ages already waited. As I arranged my materials, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. Confident posture, direct gaze. No trace of the woman who had spent years making herself smaller to accommodate a man's ego. Jameson's trial was still months away, but that was no longer the center of my story. For the first time in years I was writing my own narrative. Not as a revenge plot or a survival strategy, but as the life I'd always been capable of living. "Let's begin," I said to the waiting women, opening my notebook to a fresh page.